Well, everyone, I just wanted to, bring back, focus on chapters 18 and chapter 4, but I'm going to start with chapter 18 right now. In chapter 18, we're talking about what happens in marketing outside of the double donut and how could companies distinguish themselves and establish a competitive advantage. In this chapter, we're going to look at the competitive advantage and we're going to sort of bookend. We're looking at it at the beginning so you have a focus, and then we're going to revisit it in week 4 when we say, oh, yeah, I remember we did that in week 1, and now I get it. It comes together in week 4. So let's start this now. On to the next section. When you think of, companies, one company that comes to mind in addition to Apple is Microsoft. And what they've done competitively is make themselves essential by linking everything together, just like Apple links everything together, so it becomes their strategic advantage or their competitive advantage. When you think about creating a competitive advantage, is you have to think about what value the consumers are getting over the competitors, how you analyze everyone, and what strategies are formed. So, in the competitive advantage thing, it's analyzing and really thinking of strategically how you position yourself. When you do a competitor analysis, I think you must think about, competitors that offer the same products or class, that supply the same service. And sometimes it's easy to go after the most direct person, but sometimes you have to think indirectly. The strong companies think indirectly, and they last longer. But when you do the competitive analysis, you don't want to bog yourself down. So you have to think about, profitability, market share growth, cash flow, and you have to also think about competition. These are all things we must consider. And when you assess competitors, you have to think about, strengths and weaknesses. You have to think about, where they fit in, and you can't overlook certain things. And so you must be more proactive, and you must keep it going over and over again. And so when you think about the competitor analysis, you have to also think about the value that they give. And remember, every company has maybe a different value or a different target market. And you have to understand, do I want to relinquish that target market to my competitors and focus on who I do? Because remember, you have to think about your resource levels. Because if you spread too much of your resources around, then you're not going to be strong enough, particularly if another company comes in and flanks you, what they say, comes behind you and tries to take some of your target market from you. Now, I said earlier, think of your close and your distance competitors, and also your good and bad ones. And you know, the one thing you have to understand is if we overlook competitors that we think are not strong enough, we become more susceptible. And I want to go back to higher ed, and I think this is what happened in higher ed, particularly a lot of private schools like USF, Santa Clara, St. Mary's, even Golden Gate, is they overlook the schools like you know, the Southern Hampshire University, or the more schools that are online. And they didn't think of them as competitors, but they took a huge share of the marketplace. And maybe they reacted too late and they're playing catch up right now. But that's what I mean about don't underestimate potential competitors. And then also sometimes you might think about maybe there's a market space that's out there that people are not going after, that you must be more aware of. And I think one area that I think that has caught up a little more is the vegan vegetarian market, particularly the vegan market. And I think a lot more restaurants are opening that cater to this market that wasn't contested, particularly vegan bakeries. I find that they have really blown up a lot recently because of that interest in the vegan lifestyle. And always look at ways to consistently research, and don't lose sight that someone might be coming in a market that you might not have known before. Now, when the strategies in competition is some are entrepreneurial, some are more focused on formalized marketing strategies, and one might make more internal. It thinks about who you are. And I think in the book and also in the slides they talked about Sam Adams beer, and I think that's one of those things where they came up with a different take on the beer market. And I just think that they've been really strong because of it. Now, Michael Porter is renowned, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this class. It's only 4 weeks, but he says that if you want to be competitive, you could be competitive based upon cost leadership. In other words, you come in at low cost. Differentiation, in other words, that you look at it and you have a different type of market in what you offer. You focus on a particular segment, or you do middle of the road. But then one thing is, which one's the best? And let's look at each one individually. In cost leadership, it's you get the lowest production and distribution costs, and and that's what it's all about. You're low cost, you're going to gain market share. In differentiation, you concentrate on creating different product lines. So you might carry product lines, particularly Levi's has product lines for men and women and kids and everything. So it's a differentiation. Focus is when you go after one or a couple of particular market segments, when then going after the whole market. Like, so for instance, maternity shops for women, that's a focus strategy. So you have to think about, do you want to offer multiple product lines to everyone, or do you want to just focus on a couple of groups and just be really strong for those couple of groups? A middle of the road, if you just and I say this, it's so easy because when we talk to everyone here, everyone's like, oh, I'm going to be middle of the road, I'm going to be middle of the road. But middle of the road is not a strategy, because all middle of the road does is it just makes you generic, and you have no clear message, and no one's going to know who you are. Other people have looked at operational excellence, customer intimacy, product leadership, and I think Apple might have some of these. You might think about it, or is there something like, I think about the Jeep line. I think a lot of times they want to make it more like, in customer intimacy, like they have the when you wave to someone. So all this stuff plays a big factor in competitive strategies. Now, in operational excellence, again, it's leading that you run an operation that's stronger than anyone else. And I think Amazon does a great job at this. In customer intimacy, it's maximizing customer lifetime value, and that's superior value by segmenting markets and tailoring products and services to match the needs of those customers. And I said earlier, the Jeep, Jeep has, a Jeep lifestyle, and all the products cater to it. And you have to think about, Patagonia does a great job at doing that. So that's the customer intimacy. In product leadership, it's when you have leading edge products. And I'm going to challenge everyone here. I know Apple always has product leadership, but I kind of feel that Apple has lost its edge, or lost its ability to really, be that clear leader like it used to be. Now, there's a lot of strategies. If you're a market leader, the one thing is you want to protect your share and maybe expand it. If you're a challenger, you want to go after maybe the leader and try to get more of that. If you're a follower, you want to follow. See, my New York accent comes out. You want to follow closely, but you want to be in a way that you're not noticed. And then the niche strategy is going after a particular small segment of the market, and that's what a niche strategy does. In the leader, the whole thing, when you expand the market by new users, new uses, more usage. Like, I think they talked in the book and also on the things about WD-40, that you could use it in multiple different locations. When you protect the current market, you always have to be aware of what's around you, and you have to look at vulnerability from your competitors that are coming up, and you have to also make sure that you're not weak, and you have to constantly innovate, make sure that people know that you are the leader in there, because if you don't, then you're not going to be a leader for long. So if someone's innovating stronger than you are, or putting out things, you're going to fall behind. So that's why you should always be aware of what's around you. And you could also expand market share. One way you expand market share is, I think the great thing is to have, you know, good relationships with customers, great service experiences, because if you're really known for that, people are not going to challenge you. And that's what kept Nordstrom's in the business so long, you know? And I think that's what's making Macy's suffer a little more, because Macy's doesn't have that identity. Now, if you're a competitor and you want to challenge them, you can you can challenge a leader, you can have a second mover advantage. But, the one thing you have to think about it is, you know, a lot of times Pepsi challenges Coke, and Coke, because Coke is the leader, and they'll go right in their face. An indirect attack is Red Bull. Red Bull entered the market by going to the back door, and it's a niche market, it's a niche product, and it gained market share. And it might have been too late for the other major beverage distribution companies to catch up. A follower is, you're not going to rock the boat. You want to be in the backdrop, and you just want to, go along and keep on making your money and not rock the boat. And you're, laying low, and you're doing well. And a lot of people like that, and there's nothing wrong with that. You'll make money. You're not going to be the leader, but you'll form a life. But the only problem with the follower strategies is if you get too strong, leaders and other ones around you will try to attack you, and then you have to change your strategy. I think I talked earlier about the niche strategies, and that's going after, unique markets. I think they talked in the book about DuckDuckGo. I think you could see that, they're not going after like the major ones. They just do enough, and they target a certain group of people. Tesla did that at one point, but then Tesla became more mainstream, and maybe that's what cost them some. I think it's also, you have to understand, are you a customer, or do you have a competitor-centered company, which is, you look at your competition, customer-centered or market-centered? And let's look at each one. In the customer orientation, right, or customer-centric, okay, you have to think about who your end user is. Okay. Now, a market orientation takes the customer and the competitor together. So a competitor orientation is always look at your competition, right? Customers always look at your end user, who your customer is. But the market's going to take both and put them in unison. And here we have with the competitor. So much of this thing is, it's more reactive. And customer-centered one is, you're constantly building these relationships, and sometimes you might not be aware of what's around you. The market orientation is probably the strongest one, because you take an idea of the customer and the competitor, and those with a marketing-centered company are going to be more successful in the end. And so I think this is sort of like a overview to better understand, but it's a way to think about marketing strategically before we get into the 4 Ps. And now I'm going to go into chapter 4. So I'm going to close this out, and I'll load it, and then we'll go into chapter 4.